Welcome to the Moral of the Story, a stretch mini-podcast. This week, of Whims, Whistles, and Wisdom. What Jay Gatsby, Benjamin Franklin, and Nelson Mandela teach about personal improvement. He must have felt that he had lost the old warm world, paid a high price for living too long with a single dream. The Great Gatsby, F. Scott Fitzgerald. In those words, we learn of the avarice and loss of Jay Gatsby, the eponymous character of the Great Gatsby, one who seems indifferent about his apparent wealth and who, for most of the story, has no discernible purpose. As the reader eventually learns, Mr. Gatsby does in fact have a profound and singular desire, and a plan to obtain it, or rather, her. To accomplish his designs, he fabricates an ostentatious facade without respect to effort or cost. Ultimately, he fails to obtain the object of his desire, and he leaves no legacy of significance, even by the standards of those who occupy the shallow, materialistic, fictitious world in which he was, for a time, the dynamic social center. By contrast, Benjamin Franklin, the distinguished printer and journalist, inventor, writer, statesman, diplomat, and founding father, was many things a man of the world, whose accomplishments and even follies and indiscretions are well documented. He was real. He was human, making mistakes but also learning from them and doing good thereafter. Many of his life's lessons were carefully written in the language of wisdom with the quill of experience, even regret, but never without perspective and ideas for profitable and practical application. His various writings and teachings form a lasting legacy sufficient to secure his place in history, even without considering his accomplishments in pre- and post-revolution politics and leadership. So what do these two personalities have in common? What possible association might we find between a fictional charlatan of the Roaring Twenties and Dr. Franklin, a real person, whose gifts to mankind were the fruits of personal substance, grown in the sunlight of the Age of Enlightenment, and fertilized by an internal compulsion to be better? As it turns out, Franklin also once paid a high price for a single object. He relates his youthful folly thus: "When I was a child of 7 years old, my friends on a holiday filled my pocket with halfpence. I went directly to a shop where they sold toys for children, and being charmed with the sound of a whistle that I met by the way in the hands of another boy, I voluntarily offered and gave all my money for it. When I came home, whistling all over the house, much pleased with my whistle, but disturbing all the family, my brothers, sisters, and cousins, understanding the bargain I had made, told me I had given 4 times as much for it as it was worth, put me in mind what good things I might have bought with the rest of the money, and laughed at me so much for my folly that I cried with vexation. And the reflection gave me more chagrin than the whistle gave me pleasure." The common thread between Gatsby and Franklin is willingness to give too much for something that provided a very poor return on investment. Each one overpaid while seeking happiness and a single object of desire. But the similarities end there. In his experience and failure, Gatsby develops no self-awareness nor sincere regret for the negative impact of his actions on himself or others. His failure does not move him to a place or posture from which he could advance into a better life, through correction and the wisdom of experience. One could argue that time could have facilitated the development of contrition and resolve, as was the case with Franklin. His subsequent reflection yielded this instructive autobiographical lesson. This, however, was afterwards of use to me, the impression continuing on my mind so that often, when I was tempted to buy some unnecessary thing, I said to myself, "Do not give too much for the whistle," and I saved my money. As I grew up, came into the world, and observed the actions of men, I thought I met many who gave too much for the whistle. When I saw one ambitious of court favor, sacrificing his time and attendance at levees, his repose, his liberty, his virtue, and perhaps his friend, to obtain it, I have said to myself, "This man gives too much for his whistle." When I saw another fond of popularity constantly employing himself in political bustles, neglecting his own affairs and ruining them by that neglect, he pays, says I, too much for his whistle. If I knew a miser who gave up every kind of comfortable living, all the pleasure of doing good to others, all the esteem of his fellow citizens and the joys of benevolent friendship for the sake of accumulating wealth, poor man, says I, you pay too much for your whistle. When I met a man of pleasure, sacrificing every laudable improvement of his mind or his fortune to mere corporeal satisfactions, and ruining his health in their pursuit, mistaken man, says I, you are providing pain for yourself instead of pleasure, You pay too much for your whistle. If I see one fond of appearance, of fine clothes, fine houses, fine furniture, fine equipages, all above his fortune, for which he contracts debts, and ends his career in a prison, alas, says I, he has paid too much for his whistle. When I saw a beautiful, sweet-tempered girl, married to an ill-natured brute of a husband, what a pity, says I, that she should pay so much for a whistle. In short, I had conceived that the great part of the miseries of mankind were brought upon them by the false estimates they had made of the value of things, and by giving too much for the whistle. These examples demonstrate the perils of avarice and the related human tendency to recklessly overreach, overspend, or give too much, financially or in other costs, in pursuit of an unproductive goal or trinket, be it status, fame, worldly power, ill-gotten wealth, improper relationships, lust, or anything else of false value. Franklin theorizes that these common and frequent transactions produce the great part of the miseries of mankind. The universality of such tendencies and behaviors is not, however, licensed to persist in error. Rather, Franklin's lesson, especially in juxtaposition to Gatsby's experience, gives us perspective to overcome common, unproductive human reactions to mistakes, which range from hopeless defeatism to indifference to needlessly struggling beneath the crushing burden of mistakes we insist on carrying when it is possible to recover from them and be relieved of them. No one is free from error, and while it is unwise to give ourselves a free pass to make mistakes or be comfortable with them after doing so, we can remember that mistakes need not define us. Like Franklin, the childhood spendthrift who became a man of wisdom and frugality, whose image now resides on the face of the largest denomination of U.S. currency currently printed, we can turn our weaknesses into strengths. We can learn. We can make corrections and move on. Like the resilient Nelson Mandela, who stated, "I never lose. I either win or I learn." Thanks for listening. Check out more of our mini and full-length podcasts, articles, and book recommendations on thestretchpodcast.com.